In June 1941, a German tank commander peered through his periscope at an approaching Soviet T-34 and watched his anti-tank rounds bounce harmlessly off its sloped armor. Within 4 years, these supposedly primitive machines would grind through Poland, Hungary, and Austria to reach the streets of Berlin itself. How did a tank dismissed by German engineers as crude and unsophisticated become the steel fist that shattered Hitler's dreams of conquest? On the morning of June 22, 1941, the sun rose over the Eastern Front. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht unleashed Operation Barbarossa with unprecedented force. Thousands of tanks, Panzer IIIs and IVs rolled eastward. They had conquered Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6. The Soviet Union was supposed to fall in 8. They looked unstoppable. They felt invincible. They were wrong. Then they reached Grodno. German tank crews encountered something new, something terrifying, something that would haunt them for the next 4 years. The T-34. Its 76.2 millimeter gun punched through German armor like a hot knife through butter. German shells, the same shells that had demolished French and British tanks, bounced off its sloped sides like pebbles. The 37 millimeter anti-tank guns the Germans depended on were completely useless. Tank crews nicknamed them door knockers. They made noise but couldn't even scratch the T-34's hide. The mathematics of destruction had shifted overnight. A Panzer III's frontal armor measured 50 millimeters thick. The T-34's gun could penetrate 69 millimeters at 500 meters. Meanwhile, the Panzer III's 50 millimeter gun could only penetrate 42 millimeters at the same distance. The T-34's effective armor thickness, thanks to its revolutionary 60-degree slope, equaled 90 millimeters. The Germans were firing pea shooters at a fortress. Panic reports flooded back to Berlin. Field commanders sent desperate dispatches. One message: cut through all the noise. We have nothing capable of stopping these machines. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, weapons, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. The first engagements near Grodno turned into catastrophes. The 4th Panzer Division advanced confidently through morning mist. They spotted Soviet tanks. They opened fire at 600 meters, optimal range. Their shells ricocheted harmlessly, sparking off the angled plates. The T-34s kept advancing. At 400 meters, the Soviets returned fire. German tanks didn't burn. They detonated. Turrets flew 30 feet into the air. Others reversed frantically, desperate to escape. Some crews abandoned their vehicles entirely and fled on foot. Within hours, the 4th Panzer Division had lost 20 tanks. The Soviets lost 3. The German army had built its identity on technological superiority. Their tanks were engineering marvels, instruments of precision. Now they confronted a sobering truth. Their weapons weren't nearly as advanced as they believed. The T-34's crude simplicity was tearing their sophisticated machines apart. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, rushed to the front lines to inspect these new Soviet tanks personally. What he found deeply unsettled him. He would later acknowledge the T-34's superiority and express grave concern about German tank reliability and logistics. His report to Hitler was blunt. The T-34 was the finest tank in the world. This wasn't merely a tactical setback. It was an existential crisis for German armored doctrine. But to understand why this rough-hewn Soviet machine terrified Germany's elite tank crews, we need to examine the radically different design philosophies of 2 totalitarian war machines. German tanks were marvels of precision engineering, beautiful machines with intricate systems. Every weld was flawless, every gear machined to exact tolerances. Highly skilled workers needed weeks to assemble a single one. A Panzer IV contained over 800 individual components in its transmission alone. Each tank demanded hundreds of different specialized spare parts. The transmission alone had dozens of elements requiring perfect alignment. Soviet tanks were built on a completely different principle: built to win. The T-34 was designed from the ground up for mass production. Untrained workers could assemble them. When Germany invaded, the Soviets evacuated entire factories eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Within months, they were producing tanks deep in the interior. Teenage girls welded armor plates together. Elderly men assembled engines on the line. Workers who had never laid eyes on a tank before the war were building 5 per day. The entire vehicle contained fewer than 200 critical parts. Consider the armor. Germans used flat vertical plates, easier to manufacture, yes, but far less effective in combat. They compensated by adding thickness, which added weight. More weight demanded bigger engines. Bigger engines meant higher fuel consumption, greater mechanical complexity. The T-34's sloped armor was a revelation. A 45mm plate, angled at 60 degrees, provided the same ballistic protection as 90mm of vertical steel. Half the material, double the protection. Simple geometry defeating complex engineering, the tracks told their own story. German tanks rode on 15-inch tracks, adequate for the paved roads of France, worthless in Russian mud. The T-34 ran on 19-inch tracks. Those 4 extra inches meant everything. Ground pressure per square inch determined whether a tank advanced or sank. German tanks bogged down in mud. T-34s rolled straight over it. German tanks became trapped in snow. T-34s kept moving. Soviet crews joked that German tanks were engineered for victory parades, not actual battlefields. The ET's engines revealed the philosophical divide completely. Germans ran on gasoline, volatile, highly flammable, temperamental in cold weather. Their Maybach power plants were engineering masterpieces. They were also maintenance nightmares requiring constant attention. The Soviets chose diesel, less flammable, superior range, capable of running on crude fuel, even vodka in desperate circumstances. Soviet field mechanics could repair them with basic hand tools. German engines demanded specialized equipment that frequently didn't exist anywhere near the front lines. Manufacturing exposed the real story. German factories were cathedrals of precision engineering, clean, meticulously organized, painfully slow. A Tiger tank required master craftsmen, specialized tooling, and perfect conditions. Soviet factories were the opposite, rough, chaotic, relentless. A T-34 could be assembled in a tractor plant, a railroad yard, a converted warehouse. Quality varied from unit to unit, but the quantity never stopped flowing. The production figures exposed the fatal flaw in German strategy. Tiger tanks. Germany produced 1,347 over the entire war. T-34s, the Soviet Union manufactured over 80,000. When you are losing 5 tanks for every one the enemy loses, but your opponent is building 20 for every one you produce, the mathematics become inescapable. Ferdinand Porsche designed the Tiger in pursuit of perfection. Every component represented the finest possible engineering. Soviet designer Mikhail Koshkin designed the T-34 for victory. Every component simply needed to be good enough. One philosophy would freeze to death in the Russian winter. The other would roll all the way to Berlin. This design philosophy would face its first true test in the frozen hell outside Moscow. December 1941. Moscow. The temperature plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it dropped further. German tanks died in the cold, literally died. Engines refused to turn over. Oil congealed into sludge as thick as concrete. Hydraulic fluid became paste. Cooling systems, in a bitter irony, froze solid. German crews lit fires beneath their tanks every morning, risking catastrophic explosion from fuel vapors. Sometimes the engines caught, often they didn't. Sometimes the tanks themselves caught fire instead. Always, precious fuel was squandered. The precision optics that made German gunnery so lethal fogged over within seconds, then cracked from thermal shock. Gunners were effectively blind. The synthetic rubber compounds in their trackpads shattered like glass in the extreme cold, leaving bare steel treads to skid helplessly on ice. Those complex transmissions with their hundreds of precisely machined components seized up entirely. Tolerances engineered for millimeter precision couldn't withstand the violent expansion and contraction of extreme temperature swings. T-34s kept rolling. Their diesel engines fired in the cold, not easily. But they fired. Their simple periscopes didn't fog over. They incorporated heating elements powered by engine warmth. Steel track pins held firm. Wide tracks distributed the vehicle's weight across snow like snowshoes. They moved like phantoms, while German armor sat frozen in place, immobilized and defenseless. December 5th. The Soviet counteroffensive began. Stalin had held his reserves back for this moment. Fresh Siberian divisions equipped with T-34s struck at dawn near Klin. They discovered an entire German armored column. The Panthers were clustered together for warmth like livestock, engines stone cold, weapons frozen solid, crews exhausted from battling the weather rather than the enemy. The T-34s opened fire at point-blank range. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. German tanks couldn't traverse their turrets. The rotation mechanisms had seized in the cold. They couldn't elevate their main guns. Ice had formed inside the bearings. They couldn't withdraw. Their engines were dead. Some crewmen tried to flee on foot in -40 temperatures. You don't get far on foot at -40. German generals watched their mighty armored divisions, the same force that had conquered France in 6 weeks, get systematically dismantled by supposedly inferior Soviet machines. The panzer formations that had seemed invincible just 6 months earlier were now frozen scrap metal. Heinz Guderian acknowledged the T-34's superiority and expressed deep alarm about German tank reliability going forward. His communication to Hitler was desperate. They needed entirely new tanks, and they needed them immediately. The Wehrmacht had anticipated another swift blitzkrieg triumph. Instead, they received a brutal education in applied physics. Complex machines fail under extreme conditions. Simple machines endure. The more components a system contains, the more failure points it possesses. The T-34 simply had fewer things that could break. The Battle of Moscow wasn't just a military defeat. It demolished the myth of German technical supremacy. Their sophisticated tanks had become million Reichsmark paperweights, monuments to the fatal arrogance of over-engineering. Desperate to neutralize the T-34 threat, Germany would double down on the very philosophy that was already destroying them. Germany's answer to the T-34: build bigger, heavier, more complex tanks. If precision engineering had failed them, the solution was obviously more precision, more complexity, more tonnage. The Tiger weighed 56 tons. It mounted an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at 2,000 meters. Its armor was virtually impenetrable. 100 millimeters of steel on the frontal plate. It was also a logistical catastrophe. Each Tiger cost as much as 8 T-34s to manufacture. It consumed 2 gallons of fuel per mile traveled. A T-34 could cover 180 miles on a single tank of diesel. A Tiger managed 60 miles on a good day. Most bridges in Eastern Europe couldn't support its weight. It required specially reinforced railroad cars for transport. Moving a single Tiger demanded the logistical resources needed for an entire platoon. It required constant, intensive maintenance. The transmission failed approximately every 100 miles of operation. The overlapping road wheel design, an engineering marvel on paper, trapped mud between the wheels that froze into solid blocks overnight, completely immobilizing the tank by morning. The Panther was supposed to solve these problems. It represented Germany's direct response to the T-34 shock. Lighter than the Tiger at 45 tons, but still twice the mass of a T-34. Sloped armor inspired by the T-34's design, but substantially thicker. A high-velocity 75mm main gun. On paper, it was the perfect medium tank. In the field, it was a mechanical disaster. The final drive assembly failed with appalling regularity, a fundamental flaw never corrected. Throughout the entire production run, the fuel pump leaked chronically, causing engine fires. The transmission couldn't reliably handle the vehicle's weight. Early production models caught fire so frequently that their own crews called them flaming coffins. German engineers responded with constant modifications. Each modification introduced additional complexity. Additional complexity generated additional failures. These vehicles demanded extensive specialized training. 6 full months to properly train a Tiger crew, 2 weeks for a T-34 crew. When a German tank ace with years of irreplaceable combat experience was killed, the expertise died with him forever. When a Soviet tanker was killed, 10 more stood waiting to take his place. The Germans were building tanks for an army they no longer possessed. Hitler became personally obsessed with tank specifications. He demanded thicker armor, larger guns, more advanced features, electric transmissions, superior optics, wider track, assemblies. Every modification made the vehicles more complex, more expensive, more prone to breakdown. He placed his faith in wonder weapons, the perfect tank that would single-handedly reverse the war's trajectory. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, recognized the approaching disaster clearly. Germany could not compete with Soviet industrial output. They were crafting tanks like Swiss watches, while the Soviets stamped them out like hammers. Speer lobbied aggressively to simplify production methods. Hitler refused. He demanded perfection. By 1943, Germany was preparing one final desperate gamble. They would concentrate their new Tigers and Panthers for a massive armored offensive at Kursk. Over 200 brand-new Panthers, 90 Tigers, crewed by their most experienced veterans. The absolute best of everything Germany could field. Technological superiority would overwhelm Soviet numbers. They were catastrophically wrong. The ultimate test of these competing philosophies arrived at Kursk, where Hitler wagered everything on his faith in technological dominance. July 5, 1943. Operation Citadel commenced. Germany assembled its finest formations for the assault, elite Waffen-SS divisions alongside veteran Wehrmacht units. They deployed 200 factory-fresh Panthers, 90 Tigers, their most battle-hardened crews, the finest tank commanders the German army possessed. The Panthers broke down before reaching the battlefield. Of 200 vehicles deployed, 160 suffered mechanical failure en route to the front. Transmissions seized, fuel pumps ruptured, final drives disintegrated. Several burst into flames spontaneously. Brand new tanks fresh from the production line, dead before firing a single round. The Soviets were thoroughly prepared. They had known the offensive was coming for months through intelligence intercepts. They concentrated over 5,000 T-34s in layered defensive positions. They excavated anti-tank ditches, 20 feet deep. They planted 400,000 mines across the approaches. They constructed interlocking kill zones where every square meter was covered by overlapping anti-tank fire. They had transformed the battlefield into a killing ground. July 12th, Prokhorovka. The largest tank engagement in recorded history erupted across the steppe. 800 armored vehicles clashed simultaneously in swirling chaos. German Tigers and Panthers surged toward Soviet defensive positions. The Soviets refused to retreat. They counterattacked. T-34s closed the distance at maximum speed. At long range, German gunnery was undeniably superior. A Tiger could reliably kill a T-34 at 1,500 meters. But at 100 meters, none of that mattered. T-34 crews deliberately rammed German tanks when their guns couldn't achieve penetration. They understood replacements were already on the way. The Germans had no such luxury. Soviet armored tactics were ruthlessly pragmatic. They targeted tracks first, immobilizing German vehicles. Then they circled behind for lethal rear shots into thinner armor. They swarmed isolated Tigers in coordinated groups. 3 T-34s traded for 1 Tiger was considered favorable. 4 for 1 was still acceptable. The Soviets could absorb those losses indefinitely. The Germans could not sustain them for a single week. German crews fought with extraordinary skill and courage. Their training showed in every engagement. Their kill ratios were remarkable, sometimes reaching 10-1. But the ratios were irrelevant. For every T-34 they destroyed, 2 more materialized on the horizon. Soviet factories were producing hundreds of replacements per week while Germany struggled to manufacture dozens. The mathematics of attrition had assumed total command of the war. The battlefield became a vast graveyard of German armor. Burned-out Tigers and Panthers lay scattered across the steppe. Each wreck represented millions of Reichsmarks in production costs, months of factory output, and above all, irreplaceable veteran crews. The elite core of Germany's armored forces was being ground into dust. After Kursk, Germany never launched another major offensive on the Eastern Front. They had lost too many tanks, too many seasoned crews, too many experienced commanders. Most critically, they had surrendered the strategic initiative permanently. From this point forward, they would only retreat. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky observed the German withdrawal. The Wehrmacht's finest formations were shattered beyond recovery. The myth of the technological superweapon was dead and buried. The T-34 had prevailed. After Kursk, the T-34 would spearhead an unstoppable armored tide that rolled westward for 2 relentless years. 1944 became the year of the avalanche. Soviet factories reached peak output, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without pause. T-34s rolled off assembly lines every few hours, rough by German manufacturing standards, but supremely effective by the only standard that ultimately mattered: winning. The Germans couldn't destroy them fast enough. It was a mathematical impossibility. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive in Belarusia, deployed 2,700 T-34s in concentrated armored formations. They smashed through German defensive lines like they were made of paper. Entire German army groups simply ceased to exist as fighting formations. The Wehrmacht suffered 400,000 casualties in 5 weeks. They lost all of Belarusia. They lost any remaining hope of halting the Soviet advance. German tanks increasingly sat idle in their positions, no fuel. Allied bombers were systematically destroying the synthetic fuel plants, no spare parts. Factories couldn't maintain output under constant bombardment, no trained crews. The veterans were dead. Their replacements were inadequately trained boys and old men. Elite panzer divisions were redesignated as infantry units. Their magnificent tanks abandoned along roadsides and in fields. Tigers and Panthers, mechanical masterworks worth small fortunes, left to rust in the weather because a 10-pfennig component had failed and no replacement could be found anywhere. The Soviets introduced the T-34-85 variant, larger main gun, 85 millimeters instead of 76, improved armor protection, a 3-man turret that dramatically improved combat efficiency. Still simple to build, still mechanically reliable, still produced in staggering numbers. German tank crews described fighting them as hopeless, like trying to hold back the ocean with a bucket from Warsaw to Berlin, 450 miles covered in 3 months. T-34s led the advance every step of the way. They forded rivers German military engineers had declared impassable. They drove through forests the Germans had assumed were natural barriers. They kept advancing day and night without stopping, without pausing, without mercy. German factories, concentrated in large industrial complexes for maximum efficiency, were bombed into rubble. Soviet production, dispersed across dozens of sites throughout the Urals, continued completely uninterrupted. Even as Germany developed genuinely revolutionary technologies like jet aircraft and V-2 ballistic missiles, authentic technological marvels, they couldn't manufacture enough tanks to alter the outcome. Technology without numbers was strategically meaningless. The final irony arrived in April 1945. As T-34s entered the suburbs of Berlin, they rolled past dozens of abandoned German tanks lining the roads. Tigers and Panthers sat motionless and silent, out of fuel, missing critical parts. Their crews had long since fled. These technological marvels had become monuments to a failed industrial philosophy, expensive steel statues commemorating the triumph of complexity over common sense. Soviet armored columns stretched for miles on every road approaching the German capital. Quantity had become its own form of quality. The German army, which had launched this war with visions of swift triumph through superior technology, was reduced to demolishing bridges in a futile attempt to slow T-34s it could no longer fight. As T-34s rolled through Berlin's shattered streets, they carried with them a lesson that would reshape military thinking for generations. The war that opened with German tanks as gleaming symbols of invincibility ended with abandoned Tigers and Panthers rusting across Eastern Europe, while mass-produced T-34s paraded triumphantly through a conquered Berlin. The myth of the German superweapon lies buried beneath the weight of 80,000 Soviet tanks that chose function over form, quantity over perfection, and pragmatism over elegance. In the final accounting, Germany's Tigers could destroy T-34s at ratios of 5-1, even 10-1. None of it mattered. The Soviets built at ratios of 20-1. When a Tiger broke down, which happened constantly. It required specialized components that might no longer exist anywhere in the Reich. When a T-34 broke down, which happened far less frequently, another one was already rolling off the assembly line to take its place. The T-34 taught the world a brutal and enduring lesson about modern industrial warfare. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. Complexity is the enemy of reliability. In total war, the side that can replace its losses faster wins. The side that can keep its equipment running wins. The side that can train replacement crews wins. The side with the most tanks that actually function on any given morning wins. German tanks were engineering masterpieces worthy of museum displays, and that is precisely where the survivors ended up. Static exhibits of beautiful, impractical complexity. Monuments to what happens when brilliant engineers forget that wars are ultimately won in factories, not on drafting tables.